Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, October 2nd, 2024. Concerns about the dock workers' strike at the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports making things more difficult for states recovering from Hurricane Helene. We'll hear from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and President Joe Biden, who is touring damaged areas in North and South Carolina. The day after the vice presidential debate, the nominees are out campaigning in key states, getting follow-up questions about some of the issues they discussed last night. Republican Senator J.D. Vance on whether he thinks Donald Trump won or lost the 2020 presidential election, and Governor Tim Walz, Democrat of Minnesota, on where he said he was friends with school shooters, and questions about his visit to China in 1989. President Biden says that after a call with G7 leaders on Iran's missile barrage against Israel, that additional sanctions against Iran are being discussed. The United Nations Security Council holds an emergency meeting on the Middle East. The ambassadors from Israel and Iran take part. And with the start of the Jewish High Holy Days and soon the anniversary of Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, New York City Mayor Eric Adams talks about additional security measures. We begin with the possible intersection of Hurricane Helene recovery and the strike that began Tuesday, with tens of thousands of members of the International Longshoremen's Association union at ports on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. WUSF-TV reports the Florida Ports Council said the strike predominantly will affect containerized cargo, which can include items such as clothing, furniture, automobiles, construction, and hurricane supplies, medical supplies, and perishable goods such as fruits, vegetables, and seafoods. The council said in a news release that it has a genuine concern about getting much-needed supplies to storm-ravaged communities in Florida and up the eastern seaboard. That was from WUSF-TV. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis talked about this at a news conference today in Madeira Beach, Florida.
One of the things I'm concerned about is potentially these ports getting hung up. I think it's totally unacceptable to try to intentionally deprive people of the supplies they need to be able to rebuild their homes when they've been displaced at a natural disaster. We should be doing all we can. The federal government should be doing all they can to make sure all the supplies continue to come in here unabated. And there is the prospect of things that are critical for the rehabbing and recovery of here and other parts of Florida that may get hung up in some of this work stoppage. So now is not the time. You already have people that are reeling. You have people that are on their backs. Let's do everything we can to accelerate the relief. Make sure that they have the equipment. Make sure they have the supplies that they need to be able to rehab their properties and rebuild their homes. We are looking at if there's anything as in terms of the Florida ports and my responsibility and authority as governor to facilitate. I'm not sure that there is, quite frankly. I mean, because some of these things are contracts and you've got different stuff with feds. So we'll see. But anything I can do, I'm going to do to make sure that the supplies continue going. But that is a big concern. I mean, just think about it. This is tough anyways because you got a lot of different property that needs attention. But if all of a sudden this stuff starts getting backed up and it starts getting delayed days, weeks, or even more, that's going to be intolerable. So we have an emergency situation in our country, not just in Florida, but in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee in particular. So we should be doing all we can as Americans to make sure that the supplies are continuing to be delivered to our ports and delivered to where they need to be so that they can get put into practice. So I'm committed to pulling whatever levers I can to make sure that that happens. But I think it would be really, really bad luck for the Biden-Harris administration to allow supplies to just be sitting in the Atlantic Ocean, just on ships that are just idling, when you have people, not just here in Pinellas County, but up our entire Gulf Coast and Big Bend, who need it. So it is a concern. It's not something that will be good if they allow this to happen, and I'll do whatever I can to avert it.
Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican of Florida, at a news conference today in Madeira Beach, Florida. President Joe Biden also spoke about the dock workers' strike and hurricane recovery as he left Washington to see the devastation firsthand in North Carolina and South Carolina. The president spoke to reporters at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland.
Sir, do you have a view on automation with the dock Well, look, we're going down to see what the damage done. I'm going to be going back again to other states. But here's the thing, this natural disaster is incredibly consequential. The last thing we need on top of that is a man-made disaster, what's going on at the ports. We're getting pushback already, and we're hearing from the folks regionally that they're having trouble getting product they need because of the port strike. And look, there's a consortium of basically 6 owners that control all the ports from all the way to the East Coast down around the Gulf. And they've made incredible profits, over 800% profit since the pandemic. And the owners are making tens of millions of dollars in this. The last thing they need is to profit off of this. It's time for them to sit at the table and get this strike done.
Will you be communicating with them directly about any of this?
Oh, we have. I haven't personally, but we have.
President Joe Biden speaking to reporters at Joint Base Andrews before traveling to North Carolina and South Carolina for a tour of the Hurricane Helene damage. White House says the president will be going to Georgia and Florida on Thursday. Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, is in Georgia today for a look at hurricane relief efforts. She also put out a statement in support of the striking dock workers, writing this strike is about fairness. Foreign-owned shipping companies have made record profits and executive compensation has grown. The longshoremen, who play a vital role transporting essential goods across America, deserve a fair share of these record profits. Vice President also criticized her Republican opponent in the presidential election, former President Donald Trump, saying he wants to pull us back to a time before workers had the freedom to organize. President Biden this morning directed the Pentagon to send up to 1,000 active-duty troops to help with recovery operations from the hurricane in North Carolina. The president said it would speed up delivery of life-saving supplies of food, water, and medicine to isolated communities. And on the flight down on Air Force One, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas spoke to reporters about federal assets that have been deployed.
More than 4,800 personnel from across the federal workforce are deployed, more than 1,000 of whom are from FEMA. We have shipped over 8.8 million meals, more than 7.4 million liters of water, 150 generators, and more than 225,000 tarps to the region. As of today, search and rescue teams have conducted nearly 1,500 structural evaluations and hundreds of rescues and evacuations. And additionally, of course, federal search and rescue teams are deployed. The status of the federal response is dependent on the conditions on the ground. So in certain areas that are remote, mountainous, and that have been hit hard, we're still in search and rescue. In others, we are already in response and recovery mode. It varies according to the demographics of the and topography. Voluntary organizations, World Central Kitchen is deployed, are supporting mass feeding operations with bulk food and water deliveries coming via truck and aircraft delivery. Some of these areas are remote. We are doing airdrops and the like. We're getting assistance from the Department of Defense and other resources. The Salvation Army is deployed. The National Guard is deployed. I think it's almost 6,000 members of the National Guard are deployed across the 6 states. And our FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, is on the ground. I think that gives you a good sense of the magnitude of the operation. You should know that in the 6 impacted states, we had declared emergency declaration prior to Helene hitting. We had pre-positioned assets, and as Corinne mentioned, the president, upon request of the particular states, I think it's 5 now, I can confirm that, declared major disaster declarations.
The Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas speaking to reporters on Air Force One, flying to South Carolina with President Biden, and as he mentioned, the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre also there. This is Washington Today. Story from thehill.com. Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican of Louisiana, on Tuesday said Congress has already authorized the disaster relief funds needed for the immediate response to Helene, the storm that has ravaged multiple states from Florida up through western North Carolina and Tennessee. Speaking at the New York Stock Exchange before delivering remarks on his economic agenda, Johnson noted a replenishment of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA's disaster relief fund, was included in a 3-month stopgap government funding bill that Congress passed and that President Biden signed into law last week. Johnson said Congress has previously provided the funds FEMA needs to respond, so we will make sure that those resources are appropriately allocated. Article continues. Johnson's comments come a day after President Biden said that he may request that Congress return from recess to pass a supplemental relief bill, saying his expectation is to ask for more money to fund Helene relief efforts. That was from thehill.com. Today, Speaker Johnson said on Fox News that in the longer term, he does expect there'll need to be a supplemental spending bill for Hurricane Helene relief.
Later today, the president's going to go to North Carolina and survey the damage. The damage is incredible.
Yes.
You know, this could be, it's already the second deadliest hurricane in American history, right behind Katrina. That devastation is going to cost a lot. And we've got to help those people, wherever they are, rebuild. You guys are involved in figuring out where the money comes from. It looks like you guys might have to change priorities.
Well, all federal spending is about priorities. I'm from Louisiana, a hurricane-prone state, so we know hurricanes and disaster recovery really well. Congress did appropriate $20 billion additional dollars to FEMA.
That's not going to be enough.
No, it's not, of course, but it takes a while to assess the damage. This is a big one. It
says $35 billion right now.
Yeah, it'll be much higher than that, of course. I mean, look at the swath and the breadth of the damage across so many states. But it'll take a while. It'll take 30 days or more for them to assess that. But Congress will have to address it. I mean, this is an appropriate role for the federal government. But to your point, Steve, we have to prioritize federal spending. We have a $35 trillion federal debt. You got to take care of national defense. You have to handle federal emergencies. These are appropriate roles for the federal government. We ought to be doing it in a bipartisan fashion, and I certainly hope that we can get that done.
House Speaker Mike Johnson this morning on Fox News. Congressman Jared Moskowitz, Democrat of Florida, on Monday introduced a bill to provide $10 billion to FEMA and $5 billion to the Department of Housing and Urban Development to fund Helene relief efforts. The bill has been co-sponsored by Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, Republican of Florida, and both have said that they are ready to return to Washington, D.C. immediately to pass it. Congress is scheduled to be out of session until December. Wall Street today, the Dow up 39, NASDAQ up 14, S&P up a fraction. U.S. private payrolls, writes UPI, grew more than expected in September. Private payroll processor ADP reported on Wednesday. ADP's monthly national employment report showed that the United States added 143,000 non-farm jobs in September in a widespread rebound after 5 months of slowing down. That was from UPI. The U.S. government's jobs report for September comes out on Friday. Ad Impact Politics writes on X that Ad Impact estimates that last night's vice presidential debate had a total viewership of 67.3 million, with a peak viewership reaching 52.2 million. Today, the two candidates, Senator J.D. Vance, Republican of Ohio, and Governor Tim Walz, Democrat of Minnesota, were back on the campaign trail in swing states. Senator Vance was in Auburn Hills, Michigan.
Now, we of course had a debate last night, a vice presidential debate. I thought it went pretty well. Now, it's funny because, we did this debate, and then I talked to the president afterwards, and we talked a little bit about, what actually happened, and, some of the points that I made, some of the points that Governor Walz made, and he made this observation. He said that Tim Walz said that he was friends with school shooters twice. And that's something I actually didn't notice, that Tim Walz had said that on the debate stage. And I said, did he really say that, sir? And he said, I'm telling you, man, go and watch the clips. He said he was friends with school shooters twice. And I said that was probably only the third or fourth dumbest comment Tim Walz made that night then. Because look, I got to be honest, I feel a little bad for Governor Walz. And the reason I feel bad for him is because he has to defend the indefensible, and that is the record of Kamala Harris. And think about this. For the past 8 weeks, Kamala Harris, who never won a Democrat primary vote, has gone around the country saying that she is on day one going to tackle the affordability crisis that's making it hard for you to afford groceries, housing, and everything else. She says on day one, we're going to make energy prices lower for American consumers. And on day one, she says, we're going to tackle the instability and conflict all over the world. Well, Kamala Harris, day one was 1,400 days ago. What the hell have you been doing that whole time? Why don't you get to work instead of just talking about what you're going to do? Why don't you actually do it?
Senator J.D. Vance, Republican from Ohio, vice presidential nominee, campaigning in Auburn Hills, Michigan. After his speech, he took some questions from reporters, as he often does at his campaign events, and one was about an exchange that he had with Governor Tim Walz, Democrat of Michigan, vice presidential nominee, at Tuesday night's debate.
Hi, Senator. Will Jones from Local 4.
Hey, Will.
I spoke with some elected officials or election officials last week about their concern about people who are trying to undermine our elections. Why didn't you answer the question last night during the debate about who won the 2020 presidential election?
Well, look, here's the simple reason. The media is obsessed with talking about the election of 4 years ago. I'm focused on the election of 33 days from now because I want to throw Kamala Harris out of office and get back to common sense economic policies. But I also think you can believe that America needs to have secure and free elections, but also talk about the fact that just a couple of weeks ago, Democrats in the U.S. Congress blocked a piece of legislation that would have ensured illegal aliens don't vote in our elections. If you believe in American democracy, if you believe in our constitutional republic, you should be trying to strengthen American election integrity and not weaken it. So we're going to talk about election integrity because I believe that every vote ought to count, but only the legally cast votes, and that's why we fight for election integrity, and that's why we care so much about it. Now this actually leads me into my next point, because I want to talk about, look, Democrats, whether they agree with what Donald Trump and I say about some of the criticisms we have, for example, I think that we make it way too easy for people to fraudulently vote in this country. Okay? I think that we should have passed the SAVE Act that would have ensured illegal aliens don't vote in our elections. Apparently, Kamala Harris disagrees because she fought that legislation every step of the way. But the reason why Kamala Harris should actually sign on with our pro-election integrity efforts, things like common sense voter ID, is because it gives the American people confidence in the most important thing that we do when it comes to our government, which is voting. I want every American to have confidence. And by the way, to all of you listening out there, I believe that we are going to have the safest and most secure election in 2024 that we've had, because the RNC is fighting for election integrity in a way that it frankly wasn't 4 years ago.
Senator J.D. Vance, vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party, campaigning today in Auburn Hills, Michigan. Story from NBC News. Former President Donald Trump was fundamentally acting as a private candidate for office and not as president of the United States when he sought to overturn his 2020 election loss. Special counsel Jack Smith's team argued in a filing on Wednesday that revealed new details of the scheme at the heart of Trump's federal election interference case. The filing asserts that Trump knew that the claims he was spreading about the 2020 election were lies, with Smith's team arguing that Trump didn't believe his own falsehoods, but instead spread them as part of his broader scheme to stay in power. As officers were being brutally assaulted at the Capitol on January 6th, Smith's team says Trump was scrolling Twitter, according to an analysis by an FBI expert that is among the revelations in the new filing. That was the article from NBC News. Governor Tim Walz, Democrat of Minnesota, the vice presidential nominee of that party, campaigned in York, Pennsylvania today. And as he landed at the nearby airport, reporters asked him about a few of the topics from Tuesday night's debate with Senator Vance that might need some further explanation.
Well, thank you all. New York City was a little crazy last night, so good to see you all. Great to be here in Pennsylvania. Awful lot of teachers there, so really excited. So.
the comments that you made about school shooters?
Yeah, and look, you got to see me. These folks know me. I'm super passionate about this. The question come up about school shooting, we're talking about everything except school shootings. And I sat as a member of Congress with the Sandy Hook parents, and it was a profound movement. David Hogg is a good friend of mine. You have seen me do this. I was talking about being people where there are school shooters, and I need to be more specific on that, but I am passionate about this. This one, for my wife and I, is just, as teachers, as parents, is so personal. So I've become good friends with these Parkland students and, of course, the Sandy Hook parents, who I credit and thank them for a profound change in how I viewed we have to make this happen. So. Yeah, look, I have my dates wrong. I was in Hong Kong and China in 1989. That move from Hong Kong into China, it was profound for me. That was the summer of democracy. I said it's where I understood how sacred democracy was. It's what encouraged me, about 15 back and forth with my students, taking them to China to understand both, first of all, the culture, but also to teach Chinese students about democracy. That was part of it. I was one of the first group of high school students. There weren't a lot of times that there were high school teachers in there that you could teach in a Chinese high school. And so you've seen me. These teachers see me. I speak like everybody else speaks. I need to be clear, I will tell you that, but here's my whole point on that thing with China. I do understand China a hell of a lot better than Donald Trump. Kamala Harris understands China. I will tell you this, Xi Jinping is not someone you should look up to. Xi Jinping is not someone who you should say does a good job on things, as Donald Trump has said about COVID. And my point on this was, Donald Trump got played on a trade war. He created the largest deficit with China in American history, and he cost us 150,000 jobs. So my clarity to take away from the message is something I want to be very clear. August of '89, into Hong Kong, into China, 15 times with students to try and do this. My point being on this, Kamala Harris and I understand American jobs are more important than where Donald Trump tried to save Chinese jobs. So the passion and speaking on this, and I think being a teacher and being around teachers, trying to convey these messages, but especially on the school shooters, and I think for all of us here, pretty damn clear that I've stirred with the victims, pretty damn clear that I passed legislation to make sure this is less of an issue and trying to get at the heart of it, pretty clear that my wife and I have dedicated ourselves to making gun violence a top priority, and I'll continue to do so, and I'm grateful, and using David Hogg's name. He is a friend of mine. He's someone who's been out there, and he was where there was a school shooter. So thank you all. I'm excited about this. I think in the midst of this, you saw something very clear. It is disqualifying to not acknowledge that the 2020 election was won by Joe Biden. It's as simple as that. And the idea that Donald Trump tried to save Obamacare is an absolute falsehood. That did not happen. And of course, they have said time and time and time again, they want a national ban on abortion. So as this comes down to the final days, let's be very clear where we're headed. Let's be very clear about the excitement. And I can tell you, listening to these folks today, we're winning Pennsylvania. We're going to get this thing done. So thank you. Thank you all.
Governor Tim Walz, Democrat from Minnesota, vice presidential nominee, speaking to reporters before his rally in York, Pennsylvania today. Story from Politico. Political gambling is back on in the U.S. less than 5 weeks before Election Day. A federal appeals court in Washington on Wednesday cleared the way for financial exchange startup Kalshi to revive the first fully regulated election betting markets in the U.S. The three-judge panel lifted a temporary freeze on the markets while rejecting an emergency bid from Wall Street regulators to halt trading pending a full appeal of a lower court decision in favor of Kalshi. And from Reuters, the U.S. sees a growing threat of Russia, Iran, and China attempting to influence the November 5th election, including by using artificial intelligence to disseminate false or divisive information, according to the annual U.S. Threat Assessment released on Wednesday. On the subject of AI, Congressman Don Beyer, Democrat from Virginia, vice chair of the bipartisan Congressional Artificial Intelligence Caucus, saying today that some work of the caucus could pass Congress before the year is out. He spoke at a forum on AI and federal law enforcement hosted by CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Just 2 weeks ago, we met before the recess ended and identified 14 different bills that we believe can pass the House, pass the Senate, put on the president's desk this year. And all 24 of us endorsed all 14 bills. I think we're all co-sponsors on all of them. We're planning an AI day, AI week, probably sometime after the election, to pass them all. Many of them passed the Senate already. So we're trying to be the opposite of what we did on social media, which is to say nothing. In 25 years, the only thing we can take credit for is making it impossible to sue them, and which is all the problems that come from that. Some of the things that I'm most excited about, one of the things is the Create AI Act, a very bipartisan, 2 Dems, 2 Republicans, that sets up an alternative to the 4 large language models that are out there, the 4 generative AI, OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera. The whole notion, and part of this came from Dario Gil, who's the head of research at IBM, who said IBM's too small to compete with these big guys. And now that Elon's raised $6 billion to do his 5th one, we're thinking about how do we create one that is accessible to university researchers, to academics, to students, and to businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, the so-called democratization of AI. And that also, to the extent possible, deals with a lot of the bias problems that are natural in any AI database. You know, we know you can't get all bias out of anything, but going in there with an open mind about, especially how to deal with gender bias and race bias, will be really important. So the owner of this Create AI Act is the National Science Foundation, so that hopefully they will be setting it up. Sam Altman has bragged that GPT-4 was created by scanning all 6 trillion words off of the internet. But we know that all 6 trillion words are not actually true or accurate or healthy for us. One of the other real important bills comes out of all of the deep fakes, and not just political deep fakes like Donald Trump hugging Anthony Fauci or Joe Biden telling people not to vote in New Hampshire, but rather the sexual assault ones. There's one high school teacher apparently in Florida who took pictures out of the yearbooks of the kids and just did a ton of child sexual assault videos and photographs of these kids. Taylor Swift, the most famous victim of this deep fakes on sexual material. But it turns out Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's on the committee, also it happened to her, and she worked together with a lot of the experts to put together the Defiance Act, which passed the Senate unanimously in July, one of the first bills that we'll probably take up in November. And it, surprisingly, before now, it is not illegal to do a sexual deepfake of a classmate or a friend or your ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend. And so this additional protection is very necessary.
Congressman Don Beyer, Democrat from Virginia, vice chair of the bipartisan Congressional Artificial Intelligence Caucus at a CSIS program on AI and the Justice Department. CSIS's Center for Strategic and International Studies. Washington Today continues in a moment.
The House will be in order.
This year, C-SPAN celebrates 45 years of covering Congress like no other. Since 1979, we've been your primary source for Capitol Hill, providing balanced, unfiltered coverage of government, taking you to where the policies debated and decided, all with the support of America's cable companies. C-SPAN, 45 years and counting, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. White House put out a statement about President Biden's call with the leaders of the Group of Seven, or G7, industrialized nations, talking about yesterday's attack by Iran on Israel with 180 missiles. It reads, today, President Biden joined a call with the G7 to discuss Iran's unacceptable attack against Israel and to coordinate on a response to this attack, including new sanctions. President Biden and the G7 unequivocally condemned Iran's attack against Israel. President Biden expressed the United States' full solidarity and support to Israel and its people and reaffirmed the United States' ironclad commitment to Israel's security. That was the readout from the White House on that call. President Biden spoke to reporters today about his call.
Can you tell us anything about Iran and Israel's possible retaliation?
I called a meeting of the G7 today. We're working on a joint statement all of us agree on. from Japan to France to Germany to et cetera. And what we're doing in that regard is we're making it clear that there are things that have to be done. And it's obviously Iran has gone way it's way off court. We're going to put together a joint statement. Hasn't been done yet. It'll be done before too long, probably by the time we land. And there's going to be some sanctions imposed on Iran.
President Biden with reporters at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. One reporter asked him whether Israel's response to the Iranian missile attack should include targeting Iran's nuclear facilities.
Would you support an attack on Iran's nuclear sites by Israel?
The answer is no. I think there's things we'll be discussing with the Israelis what they're going to do, but all 7 of us agree that they have a right to respond, but they should respond in proportion.
Sir, can I ask you, what is your advice to Israel as far as how they should respond to this right now?
I leave that to, we're giving them that advice.
Okay. When will you talk to Bibi?
Well, we've been talking to Bibi's people the whole time, and that's not necessarily to talk to Bibi. I'll probably be talking to him relatively soon, I guess.
President Biden at Joint Base Andrews with reporters. Bibi is the nickname of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. At the State Department in Washington, spokesperson Matthew Miller holding a news conference and talking about a call that the Secretary of State Antony Blinken held on the Middle East tensions with foreign ministers.
This morning, in advance of the president's call with the G7 leaders, the secretary convened a call of the foreign ministers from France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. On that call, he discussed with them working together to coordinate a response to Iran's attack on Israel. Further discussed how to coordinate diplomatic efforts moving forward to ensure stability in the Middle East. Secretary then joined the president's call with the G7. I'm sure you saw the readout that the White House issued a short time ago, where they made clear that the G7 condemns Iran's attack on Israel and is working together on a response, including new sanctions. With that, Matt. Not Matt.
I'll be Matt today.
Really? Go ahead.
So Biden said he does not support an attack on Iran's nuclear sites. Is that a red line for the U.S., and are there any others? What's your message to Israel on how this response should look?
So the president made very clear what we do not support. I think beyond that, we will continue to discuss with Israel what the shape of their response will be. I'm not going to air all of those discussions privately, but we have made very clear that this was an unprecedented escalation by Iran. Israel has a right to respond to it, and we'll discuss that response with them.
Are the Israelis listening to you? Do you have any indications that Israel is even inclined to listen to the U.S. after having made operational decisions on its own that led to success?
Look, they're a sovereign country. They do make their own decisions. We talk with them at a number of different levels about what we believe is in their interest, what we believe is in the interest of the region. We'll continue to do that, but ultimately it's up for them, as it is for any sovereign country, to make their own decisions.
Are they receptive to what you've been telling them in these conversations, though? Do you have any indication that they're going to listen or coordinate with you on what the next steps are?
I think it's appropriate at this point that we keep those conversations private.
And then just on Gaza ceasefire prospects, has there been any progress on that since the attack on Hezbollah communications equipment? Are there any meetings taking place? Is there a path forward for that at this point, or has that been overtaken by Israel Hezbollah?
It's not that it's been overtaken by the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. It's that Hamas has, again, refused to engage. I went through some of this yesterday, and I'm happy to go through it again. This really predates the events of the past week, 10 days, where we've seen Israel launching attacks on increased attacks on Hezbollah. It goes back several weeks where we were at this point where we were trying to get together a next proposal that we, along with the other mediators, Egypt and Qatar, would present to the two parties. And in preparing for that step, we're doing various soundings of what might be agreeable, trying to play the role of a mediator and come up with a response that would get to yes on both sides. And Hamas has refused to engage. So it's not from a lack of interest on our part. It's not from a lack of focus on our part. But when you're trying to put together a deal, you have to have the parties themselves engage. And over the last few weeks, Hamas has been unwilling, for whatever reason, to engage.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference in Washington. He also said the U.S. organized a commercial flight from Beirut to Istanbul to allow about 100 Americans and their family members to leave Lebanon. He said about 7,000 U.S. citizens in Lebanon have registered with the U.S. government to receive information about leaving the country, although not all of them will use that assistance. Story from the Times of Israel. Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz announced that he has designated UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres persona non grata, meaning the Portuguese diplomat cannot enter Israel. The Foreign Ministry says the decision is a reaction to Guterres' response after Iran's missile attack last night, quote, in which he failed to mention Iran by name and did not unequivocally condemn its grave aggression. That was from the Times of Israel. The United Nations Security Council in New York City held an emergency meeting today on the Middle East, and UN Secretary General Guterres addressed the council.
As I did in relation to the Iranian attack in April, and as should have been obvious yesterday in the context of the condemnation I expressed, I again strongly condemn yesterday's massive missile attack by Iran on Israel. And these attacks, paradoxically, do nothing to support the cause of the Palestinian people or reduce their suffering. Almost 1 year has passed since the atrocious 7 October acts of terror by Hamas and the taking of hostages. And since last October, Israel has conducted in Gaza the most deadly and destructive military campaign in my years as Secretary General. The suffering endured by the Palestinian people in Gaza is beyond imagination. At the same time, the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues to deteriorate with Israeli military operations, construction of settlements, evictions, land grabs, and intensification of settler attacks, progressively undermining any possibility of a two-state solution. And simultaneously, armed Palestinian groups have also used violence. Hamas has continued to launch rockets, and just yesterday, 7 Israelis were killed in a terror attack in Jaffa. Madam President, the events of the past week, the past months, and indeed nearly the past year make it clear. It's high time for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, with the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, the effective delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza, and irreversible progress to a two-state solution. It's high time for a cessation of hostilities in Lebanon, re-election towards full implementation of Security Council resolutions 1559 and 1701, paving the way for diplomatic efforts for sustainable peace. It's high time to stop the sickening cycle of escalation after escalation that is leading the people of the Middle East straight over the cliff.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres at today's UN Security Council meeting at the UN in New York City. Washington Post article reads, Israeli forces and Hezbollah militants engaged in clashes in southern Lebanon, both sides said Wednesday, in what appeared to be their first direct ground confrontations during the war. Israel said 8 of its soldiers had been killed in Lebanon, and Hezbollah claimed to have attacked Israeli forces. Israel and the United States promised consequences for Iran after it fired nearly 200 ballistic missiles at Israel on Tuesday, in what Tehran described as retribution for recent killings of top Hamas and Hezbollah officials. That was reporting from the Washington Post. Returning to the UN Security Council emergency meeting, the ambassadors from both Israel and Iran were invited to take part. Danny Danon is the Israeli ambassador to the UN.
Let me be clear. Israel will defend itself. We will act. And let me assure you, the consequences Iran will face for their actions will be far greater than they could ever have imagined. Let me ask the Council and the entire world, how would any of you react if faced with such an attack? What would any nation do if hundreds of ballistic missiles were raining down on your civilians, your cities, your places of worship? The scale of this attack is unimaginable. And yet, Iran is determined to escalate further. This is not just a threat to Israel, this is a threat to the entire world. We will defend our people, and our response will be swift and decisive. Those who attack us will face serious consequences. For every missile fired, we will respond with strength. For weeks, I have sat in this council warning of the growing threat Iran poses, urging you to take decisive action against this regime. I warned that Iran's desire for dominance would not stop at Israel's border, but the inaction of this council has emboldened them. And now the missiles falling on Israel are the direct result of that failure to act. The time for complacency is over. The Iranian regime has shed all deniability. They are no longer silent puppet masters. They are bloodthirsty aggressors, reveling in their violence and destruction. The world cannot afford to ignore this reality any longer. We demand immediate, crippling sanctions on Iran. The IRGC must be designated as the terrorist organization it is.
Israeli ambassador to the United Nations Danny Danon addressing the United Nations Security Council today in New York City. The Iranian ambassador to the UN, Amir Saeed Irvani, told the Security Council that yesterday's missile attack on Israel was justified self-defense in response to Israel's aggression and violation of Iranian sovereignty.
As we informed the members of the Council in our letter yesterday, the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran launched a series of missile strikes targeting the military and security positions of the Israeli regime. Iran's action was in full accordance with the inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and a direct response to the regime's repeated acts of aggression against Iran, including the violation of Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity during the past months. Our invocation of the right of self-defense, followed by an extended period of restraint, reflects Iran's responsible approach to regional and international peace and security at a time when the illegal action and genocide carried out by this occupying apartheid regime against the Palestinian people, as well as its repeated military aggression against Lebanon and Syria, continue. Iran's missile strikes were a necessary and proportionate response to Israeli continued terrorist aggressive acts over the past 2 months. This includes the violation of Iran's sovereignty, the assassination of political leader of Hamas in Tehran and Iranian citizens, the targeting and wounding Iran's ambassador to Lebanon, and to recent assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the resistance and Secretary General of Hezbollah, and General Abbas Nilfroushan, an Iranian military advisor in Beirut.
Iranian ambassador to the United Nations Amir Saeed Irvani speaking to the United Nations Security Council at today's meeting. Story from CNN, Iran's foreign minister said Wednesday that countries that help block missiles targeting Israel will be held responsible. He was responding to a question from reporters on Jordan's help in intercepting projectiles fired from Iran toward Israel on Tuesday. The U.S. and United Kingdom were also involved in defending Israel. That was from CNN. And Fox News out of New York reports the Jewish New Year begins Wednesday evening, and the New York Police Department has increased security around synagogues as the war in the Middle East threatens to escalate following Iran's missile attack on Israel. This year, emotions will be especially intense as the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur includes October 7th, marking the one-year anniversary of the Hamas attack in Israel. New York City Mayor Eric Adams joined the police at a news conference today.
As the Jewish community prepares and celebrates the high holiday season, and it also marks 1 year since the terrible terrorist attack that took place on October 7th, one of the most devastating attacks since the Holocaust that took place in Israel. We prayed for peace in the entire region. We're seeing so much violence unfolded in the region, and as a city, we are going to continue to call and pray for peace. And we will always stand in solidarity with all faith communities of New York City. That is more important than ever as we approach this 1 year anniversary of October 7th attack. The 1 year mark one of the worst terror attacks on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and the 1 year anniversary of a tragedy that is still causing such pain to so many here in our city. We know that there are significant protests planned for October 7th, and while we acknowledge that the city will respect and protect people's right to peacefully protest, there will be a zero tolerance for those who violate the law, impede traffic, and damage property while doing so. We will not accept for people to be threatened at their places of work, their places of worship, or any place here in New York City. And as the mayor with the largest community of various faiths in the United States, it is my sacred duty to protect all New Yorkers, and that is what we are going to do. As a person of faith, I will always stand with those who seek to live in worship and freedom and security. And I want every New Yorker to know your city will protect you. No matter what is going on the globe, here in New York City, you will be safe. And so as families come together and neighbors prepare for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, our city is going to make sure they can do so safely.
Mayor Eric Adams, Democrat of New York, at today's news conference in New York City. Another Times of Israel article today. The world's Jewish population stands at 15.8 million on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. The Jewish Agency said on Wednesday an increase of about 100,000 over the last year. The annual report is based on research conducted by demographer Professor Sergio Della Pergola of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The agency added that of those 15.8 million, 7.3 million reside in Israel, compared to 7.2 million last year. Of the 8.5 million Jews who live outside of Israel, the biggest Jewish population center is the United States, which is now home to 6.3 million, according to the statement. The remaining 2.2 million Jews live in other countries, with the biggest populations in France and Canada. That article from the Times of Israel. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter, Word for Word, and we'll send you the stories making headlines in Washington every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.